Nasie in gesprek word met trots aan jou gebring deur Afgri en Jack, Graan SA, John Deere, Monsanto, Netbank en Senbest.
Good day and welcome to Nation in Conversation from Nampo Harvest Day. I am Pumelelo Mkabela. Remember to follow us on Twitter at Nation Converse. The Nation in Conversation app is available in the App Store. For more information, visit the website nationinconversation.co.za. Today we are discussing the topic, the politics of food. We know in South Africa that the politics of the belly, of food, often dominates headlines in newspapers and television. However, today we're not talking about the politics of the belly as in people who are eating because they've not been eating for too long. They now say it's our time to eat. We are talking about the politics of producing our food. Who produces our food? With what combination of resources and policies? In whose interest? To whose benefit? Can it be sustained? We know that the politics of the belly is a short-termist kind of consumption. It's basically corruption. But the politics of producing our food, surely it should be sustainable because it's about our life. To discuss this topic further, we are joined in the panel by Mzuku Sikobo, who is a professor in political economy at the University of Johannesburg, who is also a risk analyst. We have Prince Mashele, a hard-hitting columnist for the Sowetan, who is based at the University of Pretoria, where he teaches politics. We have Mr. Joe Moswangani, who is group executive at Senbest. To start the debate, let's start with you, Professor Kobo. What is your understanding of the politics of food, and how do we think that we can make it sustainable?
Well, just to start off with, politics and food are highly related. One of the definitions of politics, for an example, is that it's to study contestation over limited resources, and food is one of the most crucial resources that fuels the life of individuals, of households, of communities and the nation. In the context of South African history, we know, for an example, that there is a tension around who owns and controls the supply chain of the food sector. There's a tension between, for an example, government and business over issues such as land redistribution, land reform, who participates in the value chain. The industry, on the other hand, is raising issues about the fragmentary nature in which the government policies are defined and how they are implemented. So essentially we have a situation where a critical resource such as food lacks leadership by both the state and business, because the two are always at each other's throats. They are always criticizing each other. If you read, for an example, the Farmers Weekly week on week, and some of the articles that are published there by the farming community, you would think that the government is the only player that throttles the sector.
But we'll come back to the tension and the consequences of that tension and whether perhaps it can be channeled to positive energy. But let's introduce Prince into the discussion. Prince, what's your perspective around the politics of food?
Well, the politics of food is not different from the politics of politics in South Africa. The politics of food is about who produces the food that I ate this morning. You know, as I was driving here, I saw vast tracts of millet on the side of the road and sunflower. And I thought of the breakfast that Julius Malema had this morning. And I said to myself, probably he does not know that the oil that was used to cook his bacon comes from this part of the world. But the guy makes a lot of noise about taking land without compensation and so on. The point I want to make is simple. Who produces our food? Do we have a situation of us versus them? And I think in South Africa, that is the core of the politics.
But is it not a question of Julius benefits from this production because he can buy and consume the food, but he doesn't benefit from the profit that gets made out of the food. Is that not the issue?
It is all about that. If you look, let's be open about it. We are here at an agricultural show. If you look around, the food in this country is produced by white people, right? White people feed vast millions of black people, but black people, wherever they are, they actually don't know who are these people who are feeding them, right? So the question is, how do we create a situation where there is no us versus them in the production of food? That relates, one, to job creation, but it also relates to ownership of the process that produces food, because there's wealth to be made out of that.
Right there, let's bring in Mr. Maswanganyi, because he's involved exactly in that part you're talking about. Because his company, Senvest, is one of the huge agricultural companies in South Africa. What's your perspective, Mr. Maswanganyi?
I think just taking from what Mzi said and what Prince highlighted, for me there's really three issues. The one is talking about the food system. So looking at the whole value chain of food production to a point of consumption and the politics that are involved in that, including the ownership and control of resources. The second one is accessibility to that food and the affordability of that food. The third point is the policies that government comes up with and the regulations that are passed by government towards those people that produces food and in whose interest those policies are actually passed. And to what extent do those policies facilitate accessibility to food as well as affordability of that food for the majority of our people? So the politics of food involve how food is produced and what options does it provide for people to be able to access and afford that food.
Yeah, it is, I think, in that context that Mzugisi referred to the tension between the different players in that space. But how can it be resolved? Is it perhaps a healthy tension or is it destructive as you see it?
I think the first thing we need to understand is that even though South Africa is not a food insecure country, say, compared to sub-Saharan Africa, and in fact it's ahead of countries like China, Russia, and India, measured by the Economist Intelligence Unit. We number 41 out of 109 countries. But in recent times, we've seen threats to our food security, especially if you look at the General Household Survey of Stats SA in 2012, where it was said that 14 million people are becoming food insecure. And many of these are in women and children-headed households. So there is the real question about the sustainability of our food system, of the production.
Are you attributing that to the tension that you referred to?
Partly because if you want to encourage investment into new investment into the food value chain, you need to have predictable policies. They need to be very clear, and they need to encourage certainty. So that if you're an investor, you do so knowing that your returns are not going to be wiped off as a result of poor policies. So for example, the exchange rate is not going to be affected by that. So that's just one side. On the other hand, you have this slew of legislation from government, which many farmers have regarded as intended at throttling them. Now, my argument is always that if the farming community, especially agribusiness, the major commercial farming entities, had taken proactive steps on transformation and not waited for government to introduce these regulations, there would not be a need for regulation. So what is lacking is enlightened self-interest from the business community. But where we need to go to...
Hang on there. I want to go back to the issue of businesses feeling throttled, as you put it. Do you feel throttled?
Well, throttled to the extent that there is policy uncertainty most of the time. Different government departments that relate to food producing industry talk about different issues that are in conflict a lot of times. If you listen to the Department of Land Affairs, and what the Department of Agriculture says, quite often they don't actually speak in tandem. They're not in synergy. That's the one.
Give us one example, because, this issue of policy uncertainty, it looks like people just throw it out there without substantiating it. Give us one example of a policy that throttles you.
The one example is the 50-50 policy, for example. This has been going on for a number of months and years.
You're referring to land ownership?
Exactly. If you are a farmer and you are sitting in your farm producing, and the government keeps talking about this 50-50, and there is no clarity as to exactly what it means, what are the implications, who is going to pay for the implementation of that policy, you stay back and not invest as much as you would have invested. That affects the level of productivity.
I think that speaks to the whole issue that Prince raised earlier, that Julius Malema may not know who actually produced his plate of breakfast. But I think the issue is that Julius says, all the land must go to the people who were original inhabitants on it. It must all be nationalized for the benefit of black people who were dispossessed in the past. So he wants black people to produce their own food. And I think that that's actually the issue that needs to be debated. But for now, let's end this session. When we come back, Prince is going to tackle it from there. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. Let's pick up the discussion from where we left it off. Prince, he was talking about the 50-50% land reform policy of the government that has been mooted. And he thinks that's the policy that is throttling them, that's introducing uncertainty in the agricultural sector. Shouldn't black people be given back land?
Well, you can give black people land today if you want. And so what? I mean, farming is not a thing that you wake up and just do and you thrive. It's a technical process. You have to give black people land on the basis of having first trained them on how to farm. If you were to give me land, for example, right? I live in the suburb, I don't know what it means to farm. There would be starvation in South Africa because there would be no food. I can't produce food. Now, if you talk about 50-50, don't talk about 50-50 without talking about training and skills production. And that's the problem of the talk, for example, by Julius. He's calling for land to be taken from white people. If you were to do that, he would go hungry because, you see, what gives him energy to say all the things that he says is the breakfast that he receives every morning from white people. So what you need to do is to say, over a period of time, how do you produce skills among black people in order for them to farm commercially and not disrupt food security in South Africa? And that's not a debate that we've been having. The debate is they have stolen our land, bring back our land. In fact...
But is that not a justifiable concern?
By the way, Mpumelelo, the black government has conducted a survey. What they have found is that the land that they've given back to black people, land that was productive before it was given back to black people, it's no longer productive, right? So do you continue with a policy like that, that you see that it's not actually producing results? It's foolishness, that kind of a policy. You need training, but you also need, by the way, buy-in by the agricultural sector. In other words, white farmers must also buy into it, because if they don't buy into sharing with black people, the us versus them mentality will prevail. And I can tell you, we can't build a country.
But are you saying that because the farmers now feel throttled, as Mzukisi puts it, now it's the government now that must be throttled by the farmers? Mzukisi, let's come to you.
Well, I think we've got to, move. The first point is that I think we need to have a shared understanding of what needs to be done in South Africa regarding transformation. I don't necessarily think that the farming community or business should adopt uncritically government's position on transformation, but they need to participate in defining it, in a fair manner. For example, in the Afrikaner community, in the 20s, 30s, and the 30s, the notion of rechtstelling, sense of justice, was quite glaring. It was a driver of empowerment. In fact, even the land distribution in that community, you had to exercise your right as a beggar. So you get onto a horse and you travel for an hour, one vertical line and one horizontal line, and that hectareage belongs to you. But underneath all of that, there were support mechanisms with inputs, with cooperatives, with agricultural schools, with marketing boards, and so on. So it was a system with financing. So the white Afrikaans community is not genetically wired to be farmers as opposed to black people. I think black people with the right support, the right kind of support, and the right kind of willingness on both sides, that is from the farming community as well as from government, to work together to create a thriving and prosperous black commercial farming community. Just a final point here. I don't think, I'm critical of how government has implemented some of these policies. Take, for an example, the Land Bank. There was an Agri-BEE fund that was put in place in 2007 with 229 million rands approximation from the National Treasury. That fund was suspended in 2012 because it was defrauded by officials at the Land Bank. It was suspended for 3 years. Out of 6 projects that were earmarked for black people to get equity in viable commercial farms, only 1 was approved. So we've got to look at both sides. But the key thing is to get both to work together. Because if they don't, entities such as Julius Malema's EFF will implement a chaotic land redistribution process, and that's undesirable for food security in the long term.
I think that's the issue. How do we move away from this selfish interest where different stakeholders, well, people who are supposed to be stakeholders, have retreated to shells where they look after their own selfish interest, regardless of other sectors' interest? How do we get around that to realize that actually we all have a stake in this thing? Prince, how do we get around that?
If we decide not to move towards that position, reality will remind us that we have to get to that point. In other words, the farmers will feel the pressure and they will appreciate the risks. Those in government who think that they can force farmers to act in a particular way will also realize that they're not moving. In the end, you have to have a conversation. So you have to have farmers, white farmers, sitting with the black government and say, guys, it is in our interest to do this thing orderly, in a sustainable way, in a win-win situation.
But what prevents that from happening now? Why should we wait for a crisis?
It is this us versus them mentality that I spoke about earlier on. The people in government, they look at farmers as them, right? The farmers look at people in government as them. So it's the us versus them mentality. We have to change. For example, we need to see more and more black people participating actively in commercial farming. Once you have a mix of both black and white in farming, there will be no grounds for people in government to think that the people in farming are not part of them. Because they would know that actually in farming there are whites, there are blacks, which reflects South Africa anyway. So the us versus them mentality will be diminished. That's what we need to do.
Mr. Masongane, let's come to you. From the business perspective, where do you see this going? What's your contribution to the interaction with government and other stakeholders to make sure that this us and them mentality that is referring to, where people now throttle each other, is done away with?
As business, we believe that we need to have those conversations. And I think this is part of that process where we talk to one another and talk to each other about things that affect us rather than talk against each other. So it is part of that process. The second thing is that we take a sustainability view to the things that we do. It is in the best interest of all stakeholders, government, business, and civil society and ordinary people in the country that we make decisions today that will ensure that this country is sustainable in the future. And we can only do that when we are all willing to look at all stakeholders' interests and ensure that we are prepared to each play a role that we should play, give in what we need to give in order to be able to ensure that at the end of the day we have a sustainable food production system. And we can do that if we look at three things. One is if we pass policies that look into the interest of each and every stakeholder. The second one is to make sure that the policies that we pass are in synergy. For example, let's go back to the issue of land reform. If you decide to redistribute land without talking about the issues that Mzi spoke about earlier, what then happens when the people have been relocated to a particular piece of land? What support is it given? What resources are going to be given so that that land continues to be productive? What skills are going to be given? The third issue would be, for example, we need to think, not every person can become a commercial farmer, black or white. Not every Afrikaner can make a commercial farmer, and so not every black person can become a commercial farmer. So we need to allow in our system different food producing mechanisms.
But I think at the end of the day, it's all about making sure that, not only do we feed ourselves as a nation, but we are also competitive globally in the agricultural space. Our production in agricultural sector versus compared to the overall GDP of the country has been shrinking for a while. So how do we make sure that these debates don't detract us from the imperative of national competitiveness? Let's discuss this matter after the break. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation. We were talking about the issue of national competitiveness. Our farming, the whole agricultural value chain in South Africa has been very competitive for many years, but it started declining lately. But we know that even the competitiveness of it was mainly driven by the white community for obvious historical reasons and other reasons. Can the white business people in the agricultural sector transfer skills to make sure that everyone is competitive and therefore the nation as a whole is competitive, not just a portion of the nation? Mr. Masonga, I'll start with you and I'll come to Prince.
Yes, I think that can be done. We have run projects as Senvest with emerging and developing farmers, together with commercial farmers, where commercial farmers adopted emerging farmers that they work with and provide technical expertise and mentoring and advice. That is possible. That can actually be done. Our company, for example, focuses on bringing in solutions to farmers that can help with improving their yields, improving their practices, and making them even more efficient. And
so
those
you're not
skills,
just complaining about government policies?
No, we're not complaining about government policies without doing anything. We are getting involved on the ground with supporting developing farmers. We are working with commercial farmers in actually doing that. The issue is whether or not we can do more. And I believe that actually more can be done.
So what is stopping farmers and other agro businesses from actually doing more?
They are doing more, and it is not only in Senvest that is happening. If you go around the country, you will actually find that there is quite a lot of that happening. But that needs to happen in an enabling environment, in an environment in which government passes policies, provides support, and encourages that kind of interaction between commercial farmers and emerging farmers to actually happen and continue. If on the one hand business is doing something, and government comes up and do something that is not supportive of what business is trying to do, if it doesn't like what business is doing, then we need to sit with government and say, what should we be doing that you will support which will work in the best interest of everybody. Those conversations don't actually take place because business talks to itself, government talks to themselves, and we don't get to a point where we sit together, agree this is the best thing to do in order to accomplish what we would both like to accomplish.
Prince, what's your take on national competitiveness?
I think Joe is right. There is no shared understanding on the part of the players, government and farmers, as to what first is national competitiveness. Number two, to whose benefit. And that, I think, the second point is most important. For example, I know of a farmer in Heziview in Mpumalanga who produces avocado. He tells me that his avocado is doing very well overseas, so he's making good money, right? But if you go to the local shops in South Africa, avocado is very expensive. Now, do you want South Africans to applaud this farmer who's making lots of money overseas, but they are actually not deriving benefits from the avocado locally? So this is a practical thing. The benefits are not shared equally or fairly. So in other words, those who are in government, when they look at that farmer, they see him as someone who is pursuing self-interest. But that farmer sees himself as part of a bigger South African Inc., and he would like to see national competitiveness. He sees himself as someone who pays tax, right? But there is no shared understanding between the stakeholders as to what are the benefits of national competitiveness. That is the problem. So Joe is right. We are not having the right conversations between stakeholders, and that's what we need to do.
Mzugis, how can we define national competitiveness in the context of the agricultural agro-business sector?
The key issue for me is that we are able to feed the nation. One, two, the agricultural sector is viable. It competes with the best in the world. And you can't have that when institutions are not properly in place. The institutions of government, ministers are changing, and you have another minister who comes in and shouts curses upon the industry. So as a country, I feel that sometimes we're cutting our nose to spite our face, because if we throttle the industry, if we throttle agriculture, we will not be able to feed the nation. And currently, where we stand, this is something that touches individuals directly, because if you look at year-on-year food price increases, say March 2015 and March 2016, it's been 9.8%. If you look at the food basket, the first such increase since 2012, and this is likely to worsen with the volatility of the exchange rate as a result of bad policies. Food are going to be more expensive for poor households. So for me, the primary objective should be to sustain the sector, to encourage production, to encourage growth, to encourage competitiveness, while we also talk about issues such as land redistribution. We talk about promoting emerging farmers, small-scale farmers.
Actually, still on that.
And do market linkages.
Still on the emerging farmers and supporting them. The ANC recently made a proposal that the retailers, the big retailers, should source a lot of their supplies from emerging farmers. Would that help?
It would help, but obviously at this stage, they will not be able to meet the demand that would come from those retailers. It would help to the extent that it will provide a market for emerging farmers. But the percentage of produce that will come from the emerging farmers is very small at this stage. So it would help from an enterprise development point of view, but it will not help in terms of solving the issues of food availability and affordability of that food.
But surely they will produce more if they had more land.
Certainly, they will produce more if they had more land. If they also have support, if they have the technical expertise that they actually need on the ground, if they have the finances that are required on the ground, and the support that they need. So it is a package that needs to be provided to emerging farmers for them to be able to succeed.
And the skills. You can be given finance, land, and everything else. But if you're not a skilled farmer, you can't produce.
Basically, what you are trying to say here is that you need competitiveness in our agricultural colleges or universities who can produce the best farmers. You need competitiveness even in policy making, competitiveness, maybe even in thinking.
Okay, let me give you an example of Mugabe back up north. Mugabe, people say he improved the quality of his education system in Zimbabwe. Yes, it's true. But he neglected a critical area, which is skills production in the agricultural sector. So over 20 years, right, he produced accountants and people in different sectors, but he did not produce agricultural specialists. So when he wanted to take back land chaotically, yes, he did, but there were no skills among black people to sustain production. Now, in South Africa, I think we are actually in the same trap. If you were to ask government, how many agricultural schools in South Africa produce skilled black people every year, you might actually struggle to find an answer. They actually want to distribute land, but they don't know who and how they are going to sustain the land after distribution. And that, I think, is the key question.
Now, that brings us to the issue of labor. We have been discussing here mainly about the relationship between the agricultural sector, as in the business side, and government, and the policies that have caused uncertainty. But if we deal with the question of all stakeholders, in whose interest is the sector working and in whose benefit, surely we can't exclude labor. Next up, we'll be talking about labor. Welcome back to Nation in Conversation as we wrap up the discussion. Gentlemen, we were talking about the need to involve workers in the worker issues in the debate. You were speaking about the importance of skills development, which I would imagine would include skilling those workers who work on farms and other agro industries. But also the issue of how that which is generated by these businesses is shared. When government wants to implement minimum wages, the businesses people complain. You are introducing uncertainty, we'll be shedding jobs. On the other hand, there's fast, quick mechanization in the sector, displacing thousands and thousands of workers. How should we make sure that as we improve the cake for food, but we also ensure that the production in that process generate jobs? Mzugis?
In the past, we've had this culture of very poor working conditions, very poor working and living conditions in the farms, especially in the Western Cape, where I grew up from. You had all manner of diseases in some of these places. Workers were paid very little. Places like Grabo, your Didorans, where we saw uprising about two years ago, and dissatisfaction with working conditions. I understand that some farmers have since done something to improve living conditions within farms. And also, the second factor is that apart from the historical living arrangements where you find, especially amongst the colored communities that are working in the farms would live within the farm for many years and have very little share of the produce and the profits that are generated by the farm. You have another problem where the sort of newer generation of farm workers live in far off places such as Kailicha, Langa and so on, and to travel to farms, it hits on their pockets and this erodes their income. On the other hand, amongst the farmers, the labor cost is one of the highest costs the highest segment in their production cost, because they get squeezed up the value chain, say by retailers and off-takers. So this erodes their margins. So we're battling to find a middle point, a point of equilibrium that satisfies everyone. And if I was a farmer faced with the challenge of an eroded margins, and I'm going to be out of business, I would seriously consider mechanization because we have these structural problems in South Africa that don't require only the initiative of farmers, but also for government to create proper infrastructure where people are living, cheaper modes of transport, and so on.
But maybe the issue is if there's an upswing, does it get shared?
It's a difficult question. Does it get shared across the board? No, it doesn't. But it makes business sense to actually share in the event of an upswing.
What stops the agribusiness sector not to share with workers during an upswing?
A lot of companies, I think, do share. If I speak for the company that I work for example, we have incentive schemes in our company that goes all the way to the lowest individual in the company. If we make good profits, we all share in those profits. In hard times, we share the hard times together. And I believe
so you don't
that,
have a situation where the executives get paid millions even during drought season?
If I were to make an example for you, during difficult times, the leadership in our organization takes a decision that we will not take increases, will not take bonuses, but we will actually ensure that the people at the lowest part of the organizations get the increases. And that is the type of leadership that you actually expect of business in general, that you will take into consideration the needs and interest of your people.
Prince, let me bring you in here. Mining and agriculture basically are the two industries that have built South Africa to be what it is today. Yet, the toil and the poverty associated with that industrialization of South Africa, it's unbearable, surely.
Look, here is the thing about the history of this country. The guys who owned a factory, who owned a farm, have always been, in the main, white. And in the head of this guy, when he thought labor, he thought cheap black labor. That's how mining in this country was built. That's how farming in this country was built. Does not mean that that guy did not work. He did work. But it was, in the main, that has been the trend. Now, this is the thing that continues to pollute the debate in South Africa. Because politicians who are looking at the economic system, they look at a white ownership thing versus a cheap black thing. Now the question is, how do we change that discourse? We can change it. There are models. Take the taxi industry, right? In the taxi industry, that's what makes taxi drivers to wake up at 3 o'clock and work so hard. It is because the way the profit is shared, they have a share in that business, right? The taxi driver gives something to the taxi owner, he also gets something. Imagine a situation where a big agricultural company had a share scheme for workers. So workers know that as they toil, when the company makes profit, there will be a percentage that goes to them. I think that they would work very happy. In fact, a sense of exploitation in the heads of workers, even in the heads of politicians, would not be there. I think if we were to have a situation like that, we would have a much more mature conversation.
Gentlemen, we've come to the end of the discussion now. Thank you for your contribution. It is clear that we cannot have answers to all the questions, but I think that the conversation should continue in different platforms, in academia where you are participating, and Mr. Maswangani in the business sector. You must continue to push the conversation, and hopefully our nation will somehow get together and have some consensus and do away with what Prince was referring to about the us and them, so that at the end of the day, when we talk about national competitiveness, we're talking about competitiveness of all South Africans in the agricultural sector, not just a portion of some of the South Africans in the sector. Join the conversation. Download the Nation in Conversation app available in the App Store. Follow us on Twitter at Nation Converse. More information is available on the website nationinconversation.co.za. This is Nation in Conversation. Goodbye.
Nation in Conversation is proudly brought to you by AFGRI, NJ, Grain SA, John Deere, Monsanto, Nedbank and Senves.
I've got a question for Joe. We talk about food security, and I'm just wondering how many hectares of land a big company like Senves is responsible or working today or in the future?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I understand your question. How many hectares of land does Senves work? Primarily, Senves is primarily not a primary producer, so we don't necessarily directly work any land, but we work with farmers who are producers in our area. In the areas around the Free State and in the areas around the Northwest, and we have a different sizes of farmers that operate in those areas. So I'm not particularly sure as to what your question is directed at. Is it the size of the area that we look after as Senves, or is it what Senves is basically working on as a company?
Yeah, the size, and you are about the financial aspect. Are you owning land, or are you giving some financial advice? Or
right. We don't own land. We don't farm any land. We provide finance over and above other services that we provide. We provide production finance as well as asset finance to farmers that we work with. So Senves as a company doesn't own and farm any land. We provide inputs to farmers. We provide financial services, which includes financing as well as insurance services. We provide storage and handling, as well as logistical services in the process, but we don't own any land at all.
It's Tom van Rooyen. I just want to ask the panel, we are busy with the reconciliation of the land problems of the past for the last few years. But as far as I know, about 95% of all land claims, the claimants rather take the money than the land. What is the reason for that? Thank you.
I think, a large part of your question is correct, because I've actually worked with a community in Tsitsikamma. They had been given back their land by government. It was a community that was moved in the 70s to Case Kamawuk, and that land was given to white farmers, and then it got they were resettled to that land, about 6,500 hectares of piece of land. And it had been lying fallow, and nothing was being planted or produced in the land. And some of them wanted to have cash payments because they were settled in the urban areas. So people have, formatted their lives in the urban area. For an example, if I was told that I have a land claim somewhere in Libode that I'm entitled to, as an urbanite, I'm likely to want to take the money than to work the land. But that doesn't mean that no black people want to do farming. There are people who want to do farming, which is why we have seen the gradual rise of the so-called emerging farmers and people queuing at the land bank to ask for loans because they want to farm. And some, by the way, in fact, I think one of the surveys that was undertaken, you find that many of the farmers are civil servants. Where we bought a cattle last year, to celebrate my father's 80th birthday, we bought it from a 600-hectare Brahman farm somewhere in Elliot that is owned by a civil servant. He has the entire management system there. He has 2 farm managers for production and for sale. So you do have increasingly black people who want to own land, but it may just very well be that in the case of land resettlement, land redistribution, not everyone want to go in that direction, because the key thing really is to get access to income and do other businesses in the urban area. And it goes back to the point you made that not every black person can be a farmer, just like not every Afrikaner person can be a farmer. I mean, it's a thing of the older rather than the younger generation. In fact, the average age of a farmer in South Africa is between 55 years and 60 years. So even amongst the white community, we haven't seen a lot of young people coming in to farm, except those to which it is passed on generationally. So I know it doesn't answer your question fully, but those are things that I think contribute to wanting income.
But is it not a case of when black people lost their land through mass displacement and things like that, a lot of them also lost the skill to farm over generations. So when you try to resettle them, you're not resettling the original person who could farm, who could till the land back. You are resettling a younger generation who, because of the displacement, might not be able to have interest in farming.
Well, one of the things that we must acknowledge is that even if we were to go back to history, it could be that the ancestors of the people who are now being resettled were actually not commercial farmers. They were subsistence farmers, right? Even if we were to raise those people from their graves, right, they would actually not be able to farm commercially. They would still want to farm for subsistence. So we need to acknowledge that. Number two, I think Mzu is right. I have a house somewhere in Mukutlu, right, in Mpumalanga. I am told that part of my ancestors used to live in the area called Kruger National Park today. If we were to come to us there, we are very settled, we've got houses there, and say, we want to give you back our land, I can tell you, we would prefer to get the cash than to move and disturb those animals in Kruger National Park. Because we are settled there anyway. Why would we go and start afresh? Must I demolish my house and go and live in Kruger National Park? That's why people take money. Because with money, you can go to the mall and buy whatever you want to buy without you being required to demolish your house and go and live elsewhere.
I think the view that I expressed earlier, farming is a career. And it's one that requires passion. The fact that my family might own a piece of land somewhere does not necessarily mean that I would have interest in working that land. So I could have interest in other things where I could use that land as collateral to be able to pursue those things that I want to pursue. The assumption that everybody that gets relocated back to the land would want to work that land is an incorrect assumption. It takes passion to be a farmer. If you don't have the passion, you will not be able to succeed, just as it takes passion to excel in everything else that people do in their lives.
I wonder whether that answers the question.
Joe's just mentioned the issue of collateral, but we see in many of the farms that have been transferred to black people that the government doesn't actually give them title. They never really become the owners of that land. So they never have collateral to use when they want to access loans and so on for input finance and other things they might need. Do you know what the reason is for this? And how are we going to solve this problem? Because if this doesn't get fixed, these farmers are never going to get access to the funds they require to farm properly.
It's a problem across the board, and it's again the incomprehensiveness of our policy interventions. It applies in the area of housing provision, where we provide people with houses, but they do not have title deeds for those houses, so they can't use houses as collateral. The same thing happens in agriculture. You provide people with the land, but there are no title deeds, so they cannot use that land as collateral. And it is for that reason that when we talk about land reform, land redistribution, it must be in synergy with all the other issues that relate to that particular issue. It's not just about taking the land back. It's what are you going to do with it when you've got it back? And policy must facilitate for people to be able to do whatever it is they want to do with that land.
You see, there is a problem here. You take back land from an individual farmer who owned it and he had a title for it, right? So he could go to the bank, this farmer, to seek financing and so on. You give it back to a community, not an individual, right? To whom do you give title? To give to this entire community? It's impossible. The only way you can give title is if you organize this community into a company, right? But these people have not been operating as a company. This concept of a company does not exist in their heads, right? So you need to organize them into a company, give them all the technical support so that they understand that they are no longer a loose community of people, but they are now board members or shareholders, right? So the problem is this: you are taking land from a skilled guy who knew how to operate it technically. You are giving it back to people who don't operate in that technical space. That is the reason why we have this mess.
I think they've fully covered.
But I think the question is what has to be done, what can be done by the government?
The government must do exactly what I said now. It must educate people before it gives them back land. That, listen, folks, you are no longer going to operate as Mr. Mkize and Mr. Koza and Mr. Mashele, who have your own homesteads, right? You are now being transformed. You are going to be owners of a company. And this is how a company works. There is a CEO, right, who runs the affairs of the company. And this is how it runs professionally. Then there will be shareholding and all of the things that are done by a normal company. So government, that is the responsibility of government. Because if you don't educate people, you will have a mess. Because people will not understand how the whole thing can be run.
How government has done it, actually, they've established trusts. I don't know whether they work. I don't know whether those trusts actually do own the title to the land. Doesn't work. I'm not sure.
You, in your opening remarks, you alluded to the fact that prime agricultural land that's been given to black people has gone out of production. Now, I wanted to find out, are you suggesting that a mechanism should be put in place whereby, you know, the beneficiaries state clearly what they intend to do with the land before it's actually given to them? And don't you think that, you know, in a democratic country such as South Africa, people should actually be given the freedom to decide what they want to do with their property and by extension, you know, their land? Thank you.
People must never be given the right to destroy, even in a democracy, right? If you say you want to embark upon a land reform program that must not destroy food security, you must be very clear as a government. Tell the people that, yes, you are entitled to that piece of land only if it will stay productive. They must then tell you if they are interested in operating a productive farm or not. If they are not interested, they must never be given that land, period. If they are interested in operating a productive farm, then you must put conditions as to how they will behave once they have taken back that land. Full stop. If you don't do it that way, we will have no food. I had breakfast this morning. I'll no longer have it. Because you will give back this land and it's not productive. We all lose. The point is not to destroy. Is to implement a land reform program that will actually contribute to growth and the sustainability of our food production system.
Thank you very much, guys.
Nation in Conversation is proudly brought to you by Afgri, NJ, Grain SA, John Deere, Monsanto, Nedbank and Senves.